So it gives me great pleasure and great honour this morning to talk to you about one of my all-time favourite subjects, and that is the human brain. And I want to talk to you about the brain from the perspective of both a neuroscientist and also, as Sam said, as a passionate Christian. And I believe that there are some really beautiful synergies between the brain, our mind, and our faith, and they really do complement each other. It's a slightly different take, I guess, on a Sunday sermon. You come here every Sunday and you are graciously and deeply nourished in your soul and your mind. And I want to add an extra arm to that this morning, and I want to be able to give you some skills and some tips and little pearls of wisdom that will nourish your body as well, specifically your brain. And in enhancing the function of your brain, you're enhancing the function of your mind and therefore deepening your faith with God. And I'm going to bring all this together, I hope, in the next sort of 30 to 35 minutes, so buckle your seatbelts. It's not something that I've always been able to reconcile. I think it's probably unusual to hear a scientist, specifically a neuroscientist, stand up and talk about their depth of faith and their passion as a Christian who believes in Christ and believes in this God who just loves us so much. It's a difficult thing because as a scientist, you are literally under the microscope with everything that you say, everything that you convey in a paper. You are scrutinised to the nth degree that everything has to be provable, everything has to be measurable. You need to be able to replicate an experiment. You need to be able to prove with physical evidence every single thing you say. I've worked in some of the world's greatest institutes, I guess. I've been very, very privileged and very blessed with a gift that God has given me opportunities, I guess, that I've studied at Oxford University. I was offered a research project at MIT in Boston. I came home to Sydney and completed my honours degree at Sydney University and my PhD. I worked as a postdoctoral researcher there as well. And then I had a stint for about 3 years in between my two children. I had about 3 years working for one of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies as a medical and scientific advisor. By the time that I left there, I was the acting associate medical director of one of their major business units. So I simply say this, not to toot my own horn, but just the fact that it's so hard to have the faith on the one side and your science and use of the highest level of scrutiny. I mean, there are people's lives at stake when you're talking pharmaceutical. You know, I wrote the inserts that go into your medicine packages when you talk about, you know, what you can take and what you can't take and how to take this drug and how this drug works. And, you know, you've got the creme de la creme of specialists calling you on your phone saying, Ineka, I've got a patient lying on the bench and I don't know what to do. Should I be giving him this drug when he's got this in his system already? That's the kind of thing. So you can't just pull things out of the air, right? So I had for a long time compartmentalised my faith and my science in two very different aspects of my life. But where I guess the rubber really hit the road was a couple of years ago. I think God placed in my life the right people at the right time, and I was able to break down that divide. And do you know what? My faith now informs my science, and my science informs my faith, and it has just unleashed this most phenomenal understanding of who God is. And I can stand here before you today as both a neuroscientist and a Christian and tell you there is not a molecule of doubt in my mind that this thing here, our brain and our bodies, is 100% purposefully designed by a creator. There is no doubt. And so I hope today to be able to convey a little bit. I mean, I could stand here all day, literally, for days on end. My husband will testify to that. I can talk about this thing all day. But it's something that, you know, I hope to be able to convey just through a few basic facts and figures today and some really cool, breathtaking examples of what our brain can do. So a little overview, I like to sort of give you some structure on where we're going today. So the amazing brain, as I said, some facts and figures, and I truly believe if a person understands the nuts and bolts of the way things work and, you know, what makes our brains work from the cellular level, then I think you're able to apply the principles of, you know, healthy living with much better understanding, and you sort of got much more context to apply it to, and it's sort of a more meaningful way to live healthily if you know what's actually happening under the bonnet. So then I want to talk a little bit about the brain versus the mind, and this is something that Dr. Caroline Leaf really hones in on. She's a cognitive neurotherapist. This is sort of her area of expertise, and the brain versus the mind as a concept is a fascinating study in itself. A pure scientist will tell you that the mind is no more than the machinations, so the physical processes of the brain, the neurons firing, the chemicals moving around, and that's all the mind is. But I want to argue something quite different to that today. And then I want to give you some practical tips on how to maximise and optimise your brain health. And then, of course, once we've got a healthy brain that feeds a healthy mind and a healthy mind that is able to really maximise the health of the brain, then you bring in that element of faith, and you have what I only found this last night. These rings, to me, really define what it is that I'm trying to talk about. You've got brain, mind, and faith, and they are inextricably linked, and they feed each other, and you can't have one without the other. They really are, quintessentially interlinked. So I want to be able to use this as an example today on how, and it actually, Wikipedia'd, good old Wikipedia, these rings, it's a mathematical, these are mathematical rings, but actually they've been used throughout history to represent the Holy Trinity, which I thought was kind of cool. So the amazing brain, let me tell you, this thing here is one of the most exquisite, sophisticated pieces of entities that we can possibly ever imagine and that this world will ever see. As a pure scientist, one would tell you that this really has only come about by a series of random chance mutations over many millions of years, that we have evolved from a single cell organism, like an amoeboid type thing, that over, almost by accident, many millions of mutations have happened over many millions of years to evolve to this right here. I'm going to tell you right now, as a scientist and as a Christian, that there is no way that that can be the case. I could stand here all day and validate that to you, but just take my word for it today. I'll give you a few tips. But really, what science is wonderful. I tell you what, we've got some amazing technologies and some amazing techniques, and we have discovered some pretty cool things, Nobel Prize-winning things, life-saving things. But what science knows is only the tip of the iceberg. In fact, it's probably scratching the tip of the iceberg. What science knows is amazing, and I'm very grateful. And Newton said, we only know what we know by standing on the shoulders of giants. So we only know what we know because we're working on the discoveries of the people that went before us. But science knows this much. God knows the whole story, and there's this whole lot here that we can't yet explain. We're still only scratching the tip of the iceberg when it comes to knowing what we know about the brain. So a little bit about the biology of the brain, just a few sort of, global perspective things. Most people will recognise this as a human brain. It's exactly this size in an adult human brain. This is a beautiful replica, a life-size replica of what the brain would look like inside your body right now. Slightly less hard and clean. It's a lot more sort of squishy and bloody in your skull. But it's recognisable by all of this folding. And this folding here is really what distinguishes us as a very intelligent, higher-order creation of God. These folds here are what houses all of the brain cells in our body. We have about 100 billion brain cells in our brain, the average adult human. The folds enable us to have more brain cells in the same area of space. If it was just smooth, we wouldn't have so many brain cells because we wouldn't be able to house them in this what is called the grey matter. It's divided roughly into 4 quarters. Each of the quarters govern various functions of our body. So, for example, the frontal cortex here governs our higher order thinking, our higher cognition, our planning, foreplanning, and dreams, and so on. Needless to say, I won't go into all the details. You don't need to know that level of detail. The thing is, it's been known by, it's been called by very many learned scientists the most complex object in the universe. And it's not hard to see why. If we were to compare the brain with one of the most advanced computers on the planet, and it's often called, the human computer, the brain. If we were to compare it with the most advanced handheld computer device on the planet right now, this is the iPhone 7, when we talk about storage and so storage capacity and processing speed, this is where we really sort of get to see how powerful and how amazing a computer can be. So the iPhone 7 Plus boasts 258 gigabytes of memory. So I think we're all pretty familiar with the idea of a gigabyte. 1 gigabyte is an impressive amount. It's a billion bits of data, basically, that it can store. So this can hold 258 billion bits of data at 258 gigabytes. This little computer over here holds about 1 million gigabytes of data at any one point in time. When we talk about processing speed, so the processing speed, my husband's a bit of an IT guru. He's a software engineer. He writes code for a living. He's the smart one of us. He has told me that the iPhone 7 Plus has, so when we talk about processing speed, it's basically how many single point operations can a computer do in 1 second. The iPhone 7 has a 300 gigaflops. I mean, I feel ridiculous saying that. 300 gigaflops, which is about 300 billion point operations per second in the iPhone 7 Plus. The brain, on the other hand, can carry out 100 trillion point operations per second. So really, they're not even in the same ballpark. I'm just going to leave that there with you to think about. But where the rubber really hits the road is when we look at what the brain does. So we know that it only accounts for 2% of body weight. So it's a relatively small, unimposing organ within the body. However, it consumes 20% of all oxygen that we consume through breathing through our lungs, and 25% of glucose. And by glucose, I don't just mean, popping jelly beans. Glucose is sort of directly in the food, the sugars that we eat, but also the body has a phenomenal capacity to convert whatever food we eat, even if it's just carbohydrates and so on, into its own energy source. So there's the sugars within the body. The brain consumes an enormous 25% of all energy. But where the rubber hits the road is when we get down to the microscopic level. So this here is representative of this is an image here that I took on my microscope back at Sydney University of 2 brain cells under the microscope. Most people have pictures of kids and pets in their phone. I have pictures of brain cells. I have pictures of my kids and pets too. But essentially, you're able to grow brain cells under sort of very specific conditions, and using very, very advanced microscopes, you're able to image these neurons and see all of their outgrowths and see the way they communicate with each other and the way they interact with each other. This here is each of these cell bodies, so the little circles in the middle are about 1/100th of a millimetre across, so they're minuscule, they're not seen by the naked eye. And we have about 100 billion of these in our brain, in the average adult human brain. That's not very complex when you're growing them in isolation. When you look under, so this is a cartoon graphic of what the brain cells look like under, in situ, in the brain. You've got thousands and thousands of connections going on. In fact, trillions of connections going on. So neurons communicate with each other through a process called electrochemical signaling. So a cell body will send out an electrical signal. It'll be stimulated by something. It'll send out an electrochemical signal. So an electrical signal will travel from the cell body down all of these arms. You can see there's lots and lots of neurites. It can go up to 7,000 different branches from one single neuron. And the electrical speed of one action potential is what it's called. So it sends an electrical signal to the next one, travels at about 100 metres a second. And it can communicate with up to 7,000 other cells via this synapse. So once the electrical signal hits the end of the neuron, down at the end of the neuron at the synapse here is, or the synapse ending, is a whole bunch of chemicals are stimulated to be released into this gap. This is the synapse, is the gap between the two. The chemicals will travel across the gap, be taken up by the next neuron, which stimulates another electrical signal and continues on to the next. So you've probably heard of neurotransmitters. These are the things that cross that gap, that synapse, and enable that electrical signal to be communicated on to the next. It's a really fascinating process, and it's something that we're only relatively new to understanding, that it's the basis of all learning and memory. So the way these neurons communicate with each other in very complex circuits around the brain. They communicate with each other by stimulating the next neuron. However, if there is no input, that neuron that's not receiving any input will either be pruned back or it will go and search for an input from somewhere else. So this brain is constantly changing. Right now, as we're sitting here, you're learning more information. Your neurites are firing. This one's receiving, so this is getting strengthened. The more input it receives, the stronger the connection between the two. However, that's at the expense of other neurons. So the neurons that aren't receiving input this morning, right now, while you're sitting here, are being pruned back and finding elsewhere to go. And this is the basis of learning and memory. It's a concept that we've only really discovered in the last, say, 40 years, and it's something that we're still working out how the mechanics of this actually work. God, of course, has known this from the beginning, and He's enabled us to renew our minds daily, by moment, to increase the capacity of the synapses to communicate with each other and to build those neural networks around the brain. There's a use it or lose it principle. So if you're not strengthening your synapses, then you're losing your synapses, basically. So you want to keep a circuit in place, and that's not to say it's for a good circuit or a bad circuit. The more you use a particular circuit, the stronger it gets. And I'm going to get further into that later, but this topic of overriding bad circuitry in the brain to make new circuitry, it's possible. And science only discovered this 40 years ago and is still honing the mechanisms and understanding how exactly this works. So we're not hardwired like we once thought we were. We're very, very much able to renew our minds. However, we know that it's a very energy-hungry organ. So you may ask, how does the brain create its own energy? How does it do this? And the answer is in the mitochondria. So if we get down to the individual cell bodies, right down, this little ball in the middle is the nucleus. We have the nucleus here, and these little capsule-shaped things are the mitochondria. We've been equipped with these phenomenal little power packs. In every cell of our body has its ability to make its own energy. We have, so the body uses oxygen and nutrients, and it converts those things into its own cellular energy. So this is why it's such a busy and energy-hungry organ, is because these processes are going on by the billions and trillions every single second, every microsecond of the day. So we know also by God's amazing design that there are self-preservation mechanisms within the cell. So as the mitochondria make energy for us to go about our busy days and using our minds and brains, we're also creating byproducts. And you've probably heard of free radicals, right? So the free radicals are quite damaging to the cell. But God, in His wisdom, has given us the capacity to neutralise, break down, and dispose of those free radicals that come by. So we're also able to remove that to really maximise the potential. As we get older, we lose that innate ability, that inbuilt ability to break down the free radicals. And this is something, when I talk about the brain health, I want to talk to you a little bit more about that as we go on. So I just want to shift gears now. So I hopefully that's given you just a basic background. I'm not going to hit you with more biological facts. I'm hoping that this has just given you a few nuts and bolts to work with now as we go into this idea of renewing the mind and keeping the brain healthy. So the question is the mind simply the brain? And most pure scientists will tell you that, well, yes, the brain is simply a combination of electrical chemical signals happening around the brain in particular circuits at any given point in time, and that gives rise to thoughts, and that gives rise to dreams, and that gives rise to ideas, and that gives rise to motivations for various things. But I'm going to argue today that actually no, the mind is not simply a clump of cells sitting on a laboratory bench that, you know, we're familiar with here. The mind is far more than that. The mind is, and this is where Caroline Leaf's stuff really comes in if you're familiar with her work, the mind is where we would say is the soul, is the intellect, is the emotions, and most of all the free will. So that we have choices, and God in His wisdom and His grace has given us the ability to make our own choices with, you know, this is true love. To give somebody the free will, the choice to love is really the definition to me of true love. He's given us that potential to do that. So our mind in itself, by controlling the thoughts that we have, that God has enabled us to do, we can change the landscape of our very own brains. We can operate, perform neurosurgery on our own brain cells at the microscopic level any moment in time, simply by choosing how you think. So you can change the way the cells function, you can change the gene expression, the protein expression in the cells, and have those little neurites move to the next synapse and choose, no, I don't want to have that thought, I want to override it with this thought. And it can physically happen. It's not some sort of airy-fairy entity, airy-fairy thought that, oh yes, I'm going to change my mind. You're literally changing the cellular structure of your brain every time you change your mind. So you get to choose how you think. Okay, so in addition to that, not only does the mind influence the brain, but the brain can influence the mind as well. So you can actually change and maximize the health of your brain in order to maximize the potential of your mind. And that's something that I want to go into now, about the health of your brain is able to impact how well you can think in your mind. The fact that these two can influence each other is evidence to me that they're two very different entities. The mind is not the brain, and the brain is not simply the mind, and vice versa. They're very much separate entities. So let's get practical. Optimizing brain health. So we talked about the need for all of these goodies around the brain, the oxygen, the nutrients, and so on. There is so much evidence out there, like real proper medical research, not just Dr. Google. There's real medical evidence and burgeoning body of evidence that says a healthy brain, so a healthy physical brain, will lead to improved memory, cognition, mental well-being, and you can counteract the effects of ageing by ensuring that you keep your brain healthy. So how do we do this? We need to deliver oxygen, we need to deliver glucose, and we need to deliver antioxidants and be able to remove the waste that those cells create. Bit of audience participation. Who thinks they might know how all of this stuff is delivered around the body and into the brain? What is the transport mechanism? Blood. The blood supply. So the blood supply, if you were to dissolve away the meat, if you like, all the cells of the brain, you have a highly vascularized organ. It's the most vascularized organ in the body. There is so much blood going into your brain right now that it's servicing 100 billion neurons and then all the supporting cells and tissue that go with it. So if you were to, I like these little facts and figures, if you were to disassemble those blood vessels in any adult human brain and connect them end on end, you would have over 100,000 miles of blood vessels in one brain. That's about 160,000 kilometres, which would circumnavigate the Earth 4 times. Just one brain's worth of blood vessels. So it's really important that you give your blood the best opportunity to get to the brain, because it's got to go through some pretty tiny microscopic capillaries and so on. You need to be able to deliver these goodies via your blood supply into your brain. So how do we do that? And I think the best way to describe this process is by a simple picture. Your heart is your pump. What you do for your brain, what you do for your heart to look after the health of your heart will also look after the health of your brain. So here's a couple of little pearls of wisdom I want to give you. So exercise. So we all know that diet and exercise and good sleep and drinking lots of water is good for you. But now I hope you understand why it's good for you and that you're able to apply that knowledge in a practical way. I think you're more likely to put those pearls of wisdom into action if you actually understand why you've got to do it. Instead of just being told, you understand it and do it actively rather than passively. So exercise. The current standard guidelines suggest for physical activity 30 minutes of moderate exercise, 5 days a week. So it's not over the top, it's perfectly doable. Keep moving. Then there's the mental activity. So if you were to think of your brain as a muscle, it's not a muscle, but it functions like a muscle insofar as the more you use it, the more blood you attract to it. So if I was pumping weights in the gym, which I don't do, we would be attracting blood to that because the muscles need oxygen and they need nutrients and they need antioxidants and they need glucose for those muscle cells to fire properly. It's no different for the brain. So if you were challenging yourself with challenging mental tasks, you're attracting blood to that area of the brain. So different lobes of the brain that we talked about, the different lobes of the brain are basically attracting that blood supply because it's screaming for oxygen, it's screaming for glucose and cellular energy. So things like Sudoku and crosswords, learning a new skill like a new language or a musical instrument, just pushing yourself beyond that, because the brain is really good at habituating, meaning if you were to do the same thing over and over and over, your brain kind of goes on autopilot and it stops really requiring lots of oxygen because it's just, set on autopilot. Callan, you'd know about autopilot. Because he's a pilot, not because you do mindless things. So what you need to do is you need to stretch your brain. You need to keep it on its toes and keep it working and keeping it out of its comfort zone, not all of the time. But there's an interesting body of research that shows a very strong correlation between people when they retire and move out of their sort of everyday busy jobs and being mentally challenged, there's an exponential increase in dementia and a concomitant decline in cognition ability. So we know that if you're not using your brain, it sort of starts to die off. And we know why, because those brain cells are not getting the oxygen and the glucose that they require. So you're literally pruning back your own brain cells when you're not challenging yourself. So keep going, do the things, find new activities. So when we talk about diet, the Mediterranean diet is probably the most well-known in terms of my research in Alzheimer's disease and dementia. The Mediterranean diet is probably the most championed diet for maintaining brain health. It's a very balanced diet. It's everything sort of in moderation. It doesn't exclude anything, particularly red wine. I'm very glad about that, in moderation. But it asks, so you talk about the pyramid, the diet pyramid. We talk about a diet that's high in fruit and vegetables, legumes, whole grains, nuts. There's a moderate intake of fish, but you really need to limit your red meat intake and your sugar and saturated fats. But there's certainly a place for olive oil and those sort of more complex unsaturated fats. And you'll find in the Mediterranean, that part of the world, there is the lowest rates and incidences of cardiovascular disease, lowest rates of cancer, lowest rates of dementia, lowest rates of diabetes, and the list goes on. So there really is something in this. Then there's the idea of drinking water. We hear that all the time. You've got to drink 2 to 3 litres of water a day. I'm always on my husband about it. He's feeling, a bit flat and a bit tired after a big day at work. He's like, I just don't know why. I just feel so off. Have you drunk any water today? No. Okay, well, your brain cells are over 80% water, so it needs water to be able to just run its basic cellular functions. Blood is significantly comprised of water, probably 90% water. You need to drink water to be able to transport these things around the body and for your brain cells to function properly. And finally, antioxidants. So as I said, as we age, we lose the cell's inbuilt capacity to neutralise and break down the free radicals running around our body and the reactive oxygen species. There's a whole burgeoning area of research as well that shows there is a very, very strong link, and this was my PhD work actually, that if you deprive your cells of, so in that I showed you those cells under the microscope, if you were to deprive your cells of oxygen and of cellular energy and stop those mitochondria from working, you can almost instantaneously create Alzheimer's pathology in the cells under the microscope. You watch it happen. So we really need antioxidants to counteract the effects of these nasties floating around the body. So things like vitamin C, vitamin E, CoQ10, and my very favourite resveratrol, which is the antioxidant found in red grapes, i.e. red wine. So just a little note. Again, moderation, folks. And general well-being. So adequate sleep is something that's essential as well. For adults, it's 7 to 9 hours a night. This was put together by the American National Sleep Association, which I'm pretty sure none of the professors sitting on that board had young children to say 7 to 9 hours is what you need. However, we'll just leave that there. Breathing exercises, so we're delivering oxygen to the brain by nice deep breathing. And this idea of rethinking stress, so this sort of feeds into my last part of the talk about renewing your mind, that we can't always escape the stresses in our life. That's just the circumstances we live in. We all have jobs, we all have families, we all have relationships. We all come across, stressful situations on a day-to-day basis. We can't necessarily remove those, but we can rethink and rewire our brain on how we think about those things using the skills, hopefully, that I'm going to give you now. So rethink the stress, because those stress hormones floating around your body, if you perceive a situation as being really stressful, then the adrenaline and the other stress hormones like cortisol are released into your bloodstream, and they wreak absolute havoc on every known organ in your body. There is no doubt about that. So you want to minimize the stress, and by not necessarily removing it, but just rethinking it and stopping those stress hormones from being released relentlessly into the body. So this concept of renewing your mind. So as I said, the idea of neuroplasticity is something that is sort of an exciting new frontier, relatively speaking, only in the last 40 years. And we've only really given it a name, neuroplasticity or synaptic plasticity, this ability to change the landscape of our own brain cells within our brain. But God has equipped us with this capacity from the beginning. Our thoughts are extremely powerful. He says, the Bible says, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Isn't that amazing? You can transform yourself by renewing your mind. He knows this, and he's given us the equipment with which we can do it. So this idea of positive thinking, the old adage in neuroscience is that neurons that fire together will wire together. As I said, the more you fire one particular sequence of neurons in your brain, the stronger those connections become. And our thoughts are extremely powerful on a physiological level. It's not just something that you keep and you contain. It's not just a thought that floats around in your grey matter. It has very real and very physiological impacts. And I like to use the example of the noise at the window. So my husband goes away for work from time to time, and I'm a bit of a scaredy cat when I'm home by myself. So at night time, I always have terrible night sleeps when he's away, to the point where if I hear a noise at the window, I can feel the adrenaline, my heart rate goes up, my respiration, my breathing rate goes up, I can feel my heart pumping in my chest, I get sweaty, right? But 100% of the time, that noise at the window is just a palm frond scratching at the glass. So you can see how just a tiny instantaneous thought like that has such profound physiological effects. This happens more, so that's quite an acute and extreme example, but the idea that thoughts can change your physiology and can have such a powerful effect on your body is, I guess, when we talk about, say, a job. And I would urge you to start rethinking about the way you consider stresses in your life. So we all have jobs and we all have relationships and so on, like I said. And sometimes they are incredibly stressful, but I think if we chose to look at it like a blessing in our life, I believe that the fruits of the Spirit are very, very rarely developed through the normal smooth sailing circumstances of life. Our chances, our opportunity to refine and shape our character to be more godlike, as it says in Isaiah 43, is that it needs to be put through the furnace of suffering and of affliction. So we really need those stresses, I guess, in our life, and to consider them in a different way. Just rethink the way you do it. Think about it as your patience branch being pruned, or your self-control branch being pruned, or your gentleness branch being pruned every time you're put in these challenging situations. So the idea of positive thinking to rewire and override those negative thought processes is possible at a very physiological and biological level. It's not just something that you have to worry about, oh, I need to overcome my thoughts. You can do it. It'll physically happen in your brain, and you'll feel the benefits of it. So God asks us, take every thought and make it obedient to Christ. So take captive every thought. Do not let a single thought go through your head unchecked. The average adult will have 70,000 individual thoughts per day. If you're a woman, you'll probably have 20,000 of them at the same time. Not saying that's a good thing, but we are in charge of sculpting the landscape of our own brains and minds. So I'm going to ask you to filter your thoughts through the lens of God. And the way to better do this is to deepen your relationship with God, where it becomes almost like the habituated way to think is to filter everything you think through a lens of God. So the most important way to do this, really, from a brain perspective, is through prayer and meditation. And this is where I think it gets really exciting. And there is now a whole new, just in the last sort of 10 years, really, when you look to the body of evidence and literature that's coming out, there's a whole new area of research called neurotheology. And it looks at the power of prayer and your belief in God and your faith as a Christian to impact your brain physically. So I'm going to show you some really cool stuff. What I think and what I'm about to show you is that God has given us this piece of equipment right here as a tool for communicating directly with him. I always get really emotional when I say this, and I think this is the Spirit saying, yes, you're on the right track, tell them. That really, it's an earthly mechanism to speak with him in the heavenly realm. And there is scientific evidence for this, which I'm about to show you. When you look at the brain scans of somebody, so this was a study run in the US about 5 years ago by a neurology team. So this is a very sort of medical at the highest level. They ran brain scans on people that were just going about their daily activities. So this is called a baseline scan. And then these people were put through a program of regular meditation and prayer. And they found that over the course of the period of the study, they found that people that were first at baseline had a certain level of activation throughout the brain. So this is just a cross-section sort of about the middle of the brain looking down. Areas of red indicate high level of activation, and areas of blue denote very low levels of activation. The black bits are just the empty ventricles inside our head. That's where all the fluid sits. But we found that, not we, I didn't do the study, but they found that as a person prays, there is 4 major changes that happen. There are 4 major changes. Firstly, the language centres in the brain are really highly activated. And this is quite interesting because when they compared somebody doing sort of atheist meditation, so somebody that's just doing an abstract stillness of the mind, compared to someone that's praying, you get down here where the arrow is, you get increased activation of the language centres. The brain activity and the pattern of activity in someone that's praying to God, even quietly in their own minds and not speaking the words, is identical to the pattern of activity that somebody has when they're standing in front of another person having a conversation. So it's like you're physically in the presence of a physical entity when you're having this conversation with God. Secondly, the frontal cortex, which, as I said earlier in the talk, this is the part of the brain that governs all of our sort of higher order thinking and thought processing and higher cognition processes. We see that there's actually an increase in activity in this area. So we know that there's greater focused attention and greater ability to process thought. So there's higher cognition, and this is all measured by very scientific tests. It's not just something like someone woke up or came out of a prayer session and said, yeah, I feel smarter. I think my memory's improved. Yeah, I definitely feel sharper in the mind. These are all done through proper cognitive neuropsychology tests. And what's interesting is over the course of this study, not only did the activity increase, but the size of the brain increased. So the actual physical size of the prefrontal cortex grew. So not only are you stimulating new neurites and having this activity between the neurons, but you're actually creating neurogenesis, which is the production of new brain cells, which is why the brain is getting larger in that area. So the fourth major thing was the third major thing was the activation of this little area behind the frontal cortex called the anterior cingulate cortex, or the ACC. And this is known as the heart of the brain. So this is the area of the brain that we process love and compassion and empathy and that awareness of others. So this here was literally activated while they were in prayer with God. Finally, the limbic system. So the limbic system is the part of the brain, and this is right in the middle of the brain here. Sorry, my pointers, I'm all over the show. See here? Compared to here, it's very active over here, and it's very deactivated over here. This part of the brain is responsible for all of the sort of the negative emotions like hate, anger, resentment, bitterness, guilt. And these are very, very active areas in somebody with depression or with anger management issues. This is a neuropsychological term, but this is certainly overactivated in people with those sort of emotional issues. However, while you're praying with God, you literally are incapacitated from being able to activate that part of your brain while you're upping your activity in the love center of your brain. So I think it's kind of cool when they have a look at sort of from the scientific point of view what benefits accrue to people that go through this prayer program and this sort of regular prayer and meditation. They found that, in fact, there was a reduction in stress hormone, as you'd imagine, and blood pressure, reduced depression, improved memory and cognition. So this list here is quite remarkable in itself. There was a neurosurgeon over in the States as well. So I just saw a talk that he gave. This is a more anecdotal evidence, but he's a Christian neurosurgeon, and he swears by praying with his patients and praying with the patients of the family of his patients both before and after major neurosurgery, and he has no hint of doubt that post-recovery is much quicker patients that pray and have a relationship with God. So, I gave it away. Finally, well, you kind of got that message, I think. But the most astonishing part of all is that the type of God that you pray to and that you meditate on is instrumental in whether you accrue these benefits or not, and whether you accrue these brain changes and these benefits. If you pray on a God of love, you will have these benefits. If you pray on a God of fear, a God that fearmongers, and a God of coercion, you don't only not get this, you get the exact opposite, and you see the opposite effects of activation around the brain. So we are literally, and that's what I was saying, we are literally wired for love. Only when we pray and have a relationship with a loving God are we able to grow and heal our brains. We literally flourish. We literally give life to our brains and maximize our potential when we meditate and pray on a God of love. He's given us this choice as well. This is what I said, it's true love. When he's given us the choice, we can choose the kind of God that we want to pray, and we can choose whether we believe or not. But when you believe, and when you believe that he is a good God and he is a God of love, have a go at what happens to your brain. You can't tell me that this is just randomly manifested over a period of millions of years from a single-celled organism by random chance mutations has brought us to this. It's just impossible, and science will probably never be able to explain it, but that's where we take that leap of faith. You know, we know our souls already know what our mind and is still kind of catching up, I guess. Our minds are still catching up with what the rest of us knows in our heart and our soul. So God's character of love is revealed to us through Jesus and through his word. And the word love itself appears no less than 551 times in the Bible, in the NIV version at least. So, and as I said, conversely, fear is the toxic sort of pruning, cell death kind of mechanism in the brain that will stop life from happening. So we need to be able to override these thoughts. How much prayer and meditation, just finally. So this is something that I think is amazing too. You can accrue those kind of changes in your brain and actually grow areas of your brain if you meditate and pray on a God of love for 12 minutes a day for only 8 weeks. This is the kind of stuff that, you know, you're not going for months and years to accrue these benefits. It's happening right now when you think about God as a God of love and you talk to him. So I would urge you, and many of you will probably already do this, but 12 minutes a day, it's not a huge task. If you can spend just 12 minutes a day meditating and praying on a God of love and having a conversation with him and deepening your relationship with him for just 12 minutes a day, you're going to really impact the physiology of your brain and maximize your potential to go further. Give yourself positive thoughts and deepen your faith with him. There's those 3 linked circles that I showed you. So again, just a couple more scriptures to really, just bring home and consolidate this message that God is central to this right here. The mind governed by the flesh is death, but the mind governed by the Spirit is life and peace. God in his grace has given us the right to know the mind of Christ by giving us the mind of Christ. We have the potential to think like Christ. He's given us, 1 Corinthians 2 says that we have been given the mind of Christ. So understand that and know that. And as you go forward today, please understand that this is just the way he's made you. Lay your foundations of positive thinking in the Lord and build yourself up. Renew your mind through your love of him and the knowledge of his love for you. And finally, just be still in his presence and just know that he's God. Thank you.